So I've covered a ton of material and on the topic of design control and risk. Again, if there's something specific that you want to get into today, I know we've got a few minutes left for questions. And if we don't get to everything today, or you have something you want to reach out to me directly with, my phone number and email is on screen. And Joe, let me hand it back to you.
I have the first question. The question is, how do you know someone's a gifted presenter? And the answer is when hundreds of people attend and nobody left. You
Thanks,
covered
Joe.
76 slides and everyone is still here.
Well, thank
You
you.
can talk to my buddies anytime you like. There are far more questions than we will address with 5 minutes remaining. I think what I'll do this time is we'll take the video replay will stop here, and I'll start a new one now, and that'll be a question and answer session. So if you have time, we can stay on. Those of you who have a hard stop at the top of the hour, don't worry, we'll be recording this, and those questions that we don't get to at all, John will certainly get back to you, each and every one. So the first question comes from Clint, who asks, please give an example of a design requirement that is not variable and how it would be reworded, pardon me, not variable, verifiable, and how it would be reworded to be verifiable.
Oh, sure. So uh, good question, Clint. So there was an example earlier on in the presentation where we talked about an example where the design input said that the catheter must be flexible, and I can't remember the exact wording on the slide, but I'll do my best to give verbatim what was included. But the catheter must be flexible is not verifiable because flexible means something different to me than it does for you. So instead, to make that verifiable, I described, it must be be able to bend into a 50 millimeter coil repeatedly for 50 cycles. But I want to be able to define that fuzzy, ambiguous term of flexible. I want to put some clarity around what that means. So that's one example. Another example was the device must be easy to manipulate. Easy is, what does that mean? That's vague and ambiguous. So I may say that the catheter must have a 1-to-1 torque ratio. So that means on the back end, when I twist the back end, that is going to do the same thing at the tip. So that is a way to articulate or define easy to manipulate. Hopefully those examples make a little bit of sense.
Bill asks, isn't there redundancy between risk management and traceability matrices? Bill is not crazy about putting the same information in two different places.
I'm going to speculate a bit, Bill, but the intent, I'm with you. I am not crazy about redundancy either. In fact, it used to drive me crazy when I was early on in my career because of the design control processes that our companies that I worked with had in place. They had a lot of redundancy things. I had a lot of copy and paste. So I had this form and I have to copy it into this form, and then this form had this form. And it was just like it was wasting a lot of time and wasn't adding value, and it was driving me crazy. So I'm with you there. I don't like redundancy either. But risk in design control, they really should not be redundant. Risk is looking at this, the hazardous situation and the harm that can result from that hazardous situation, and then all the possible events that could lead to that situation and hazards and so on. And when I understand that and what the risk is involved with that, that actually should feed back into my design and development process so that I make sure that I have design inputs and requirements and specifications and verification and validation to prove that. So they really are different views of the world. But they should be connected. They should be interlinked together. But they really shouldn't be redundant. So if you want to talk more about that, please feel free to reach out to me and we can talk specifics.
I suspect you will. He has a few more questions in queue, but I'm going to give someone else a chance at the moment. Praful asks, heard recently that FDA now accepts ISO 1345 2016 certificate as being compliance to QSR. Is that true?
That is not, I mean, there's some truth to that, but let me clarify some details around that. First of all, in the United States, if you're a medical device company, you must demonstrate and comply with FDA 21 CFR Part 820, the quality system regulations. That's the must. ISO, if you have ISO 13485 certification, that does not mean that FDA believes you necessarily to be compliant to the regulations, that we're not quite there yet. Now, there are a couple of things that are in place. So we've got this program in the world now called the MDSAP, Medical Device Single Audit Program, of which FDA, as well as a few other regulatory bodies throughout the world who basically defined in that program. And you could go through an MDSAP audit. MDSAP audits generally would mean that you're also being audited to ISO 13485 2016 as well. And so going through that MDSAP is basically you're getting an ISO audit, but that's also satisfying the FDA needs to be able to demonstrate that your quality system is compliant with the FDA regulations. Now, I believe that what you said, or your question about will FDA accept ISO 13485 certification as proof or evidence to comply with regulations, I believe we're on that path as an industry. In fact, I was at an event a few weeks ago where I actually heard FDA say, yes, that is where FDA wants to move towards, but we're a few years away from that being a reality.
Okay, let's try to speed up our answer a little bit affectionately. We got a whole queue here. George wants to know, when it comes to risk, are all types of risk, when it comes to risk, is it all types of risk, product, quality, user, supplier, regulatory, business, etc.?
That's a really good question. And you said this came from Bill?
From George.
Oh, George. Sorry, George. George and Bill don't sound
Maybe I
anything
said
alike.
Bill.
I don't know. I might have heard Bill. George, really great question. The thing that I like to think about from a risk standpoint is I want to think about that patient, and I want to think about that end user. And the way my brain is wired is I think about, and engineers sometimes can go here pretty quickly, a little too quickly at times, but I think about what could happen. What are the harms that could happen from this product? Not because I'm sadistic per se, but I want to make sure that I understand the ramifications of the use of my product, good or bad, right or wrong, per my instructions or against my instructions. What are the things that could happen when this product is at point of use? And that really helps me better understand what are all the situations that would have to occur, or the patient or the doctor or nurse would have to be in for that harm to even have a possibility. So that's the way I think about it, is all these situations. So once I understand those situations, the events that lead to those situations, but focusing first and foremost on that patient or that end user, then that really, whether or not it's business or manufacturing process or design or use or whatever, it's sort of a moot point, at least the way I look at it, because it's going to drive decisions for me to make sure that I'm designing, developing, manufacturing the best possible product that I can to mitigate, reduce, and control risk as it relates to that patient and that end user. So it might drive activities from a design and development process. It might drive activities from a business perspective. It might drive user training programs. There's a lot of different possibilities. So that's the way I think of it. I want to be more holistic, more patient-centered in my risk management efforts.
I'm reading ahead, and there's some really good questions here. I hope we can
Okay.
stay on a little bit. Beth asks, can John also provide some examples where the medical device is software only? She has a hard time applying the design control requirements to software.
Sure. That's a terrific question as well. And keep in mind that the design control regulations, the things that are defined from 820.30 and that are also defined in section 7.3 of ISO 13485, they apply to medical devices. Doesn't matter if it's a mechanical product, doesn't matter if it's a hardware product, doesn't matter if it's an IVD or software. The expectation is that you're defining your design control activities as long as it's just determined and to be a medical device. And software as a medical device is a medical device, so that means 820.30 applies. That means ISO 13485 section 7.3 applies. The tricky part is that software developers speak a different language from FDA, ISO regulatory speak. And so there's a relationship there. So if you think about, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing, because in software speak, a common term that's used is a URS, user requirements specification. And you probably remember earlier today in the presentation where I said requirements were like inputs and specifications were like outputs. Well, and I told you the words get in the way, and I told you it was a matter of semantics, and this is semantics, and this is one of those cases where we're certainly going to confuse matters a bit, so bear with me. But a common term that's used in software speak is URS, user requirement specification. That's analogous to user needs. And then there's another common term, software requirement specification. That's analogous to design inputs. And then there's a software design specification or a development specification, or there's a couple other acronyms that are used there, but that's analogous to design outputs. And then verification, software verification. Sometimes in the software world, V and V are kind of lumped together. But think of verification from a design perspective is like unit testing, and validation is more like system level testing. So it is absolutely the same thing that you're doing from a design and development process for your software as a med device. You may not use the same terms, but I assure you that if you're going through a process following a methodology, that you're meeting the general intent of design controls. You just may not be using the same terminology. You may not be documenting things in the same fashion. You might you might need to put some processes in place to better align with that. And the good news, I think it was Beth that asked the question. We have workflows in Greenlight Guru that are designed for software as a medical device for your specific use case that will keep you compliant to FDA and to ISO 13485.
I'm going to jump ahead because Alex asked a related question. How does Greenlight Guru software help identify specifications that may be in conflict for 2 or more user needs? An example is given, but perhaps that's enough to get you started.
Eric, let me.
Alex,
Oh, Joe, I'm a hot mess today, huh?
I think you did pretty well, all told.
Okay, Alex.
Just don't address anybody by name.
Or remember their name when you say it, right? All right, so Alex, it's a really good question. Yeah, Greenlight is a visual representation of traceability, showing how everything is connected and related to one another. Now there are points in time where if there's information that's missing or not connected or not linked, that there's going to be a visual indicator or a flag that shows you that. Now, as far as your specific example, to being able to show that something is in conflict with one another, in some respects, that is a really, really challenging, I would say, almost difficult thing for software to do, because now we're asking the software to interpret the words that you use and to apply your interpretation of that word and the definition to all the other things that you put in there. So we
I'll
don't,
go
I
ahead
guess.
and give you the exact example. For
Okay.
example, a catheter has a user need to maximize flow rate, but a
Okay.
conflicting requirement to minimize diameter.
Yeah, the classic
Can the
example.
software flag such a conflict for the development team, or would this be the sort of thing we find in design review?
It's going to be the thing you find during design review. That's the whole idea. But we don't take people out of the process. We have built the process in such a way that that doesn't. So it's not cumbersome. And I think that's so much of a big challenge with a lot of companies today is their processes get in the way, and the processes prevent people from actually being able to have good discussions around these types of topics. But the classic flow rate. I mean, I'm an old catheter guy, and I swear to you, I used to have people that would give me user needs that said the ID had to be bigger than the OD. Think about that for a moment, and that I had to have a maximized flow rate, and that was just not possible. And we would capture these details oftentimes as user needs, but we had to this is why I'm an engineer. That's why I made the big bucks, and that's why my colleagues were on the team, is we had to assess and evaluate how many of those things were impossible. And I guess the good news is it was always a vote of confidence that people thought we could actually make the inner diameter larger than the outer diameter. I mean, engineers are wonderful people, but that is the whole idea, the whole intent of the design review process. It should be cross-functional in nature, and you should assess and confirm these types of details to make sure that they're not in conflict with one another. And that's why we actually do sign-offs. So there's not going to be an automated way to do that. We're still including people in the process. We're just giving you better solutions to enable more thorough review and approval of those kinds of aspects. Good question.
Kit is a bit confused regarding design input versus output. Um, for example, to meet a product requirement, there will be an electrical component, a mechanical component, and a software component. How are these categorized?
All right, so Kit, first of all, the requirement of electrical component, mechanical component, and so on. Um, that's a bit fuzzy, a bit ambiguous. So my
I
encouragement.
cut ahead a little bit. I was trying to shorten it.
Oh,
My
okay.
bad.
No,
During
that's
my
okay.
time in medical device development, our product requirements often need to be broken down into additional documentation and
Sure.
specification, closer to how the product, blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
So are these, do they go into the output field or the input field?
Right. Right. So the inputs describe the what all the things that your product needs to do. So if you broke it down, like you have multi-level components into your design and development efforts. So you may have your design control activities, and you define components or subsystems. And so like you have this section for electrical, and then you have another section for mechanical, and another section for firmware, and so on. That's fine. And within that sort of that subheading or that subcomponent, you would define the specific design input requirements. Again, the what. What does that electrical system need to do? Does it have to be, certain sort of performance criteria? What kind of functionality does it need to have? But be specific as it relates to that specific subsystem or that component, and do that for each of your subsystems. Same thing with mechanical aspects. Same thing with the software aspects. Be specific with those design inputs. Again, you're defining all of the what's that subsystem may do. And then it kind of boils back up, and as a system level, you may have your own level of design inputs. What is the system as a whole when you combine the electrical and the firmware and the software and the mechanical and then this and that? When you combine all that together, there may be a higher level of all the what's from a system level performance standpoint. But the specifications, the design outputs define the specific criteria. You may define a printed circuit board schematic. You may define a bill of material of the printed circuit board. You may define the specific code of the firmware. You may have material specifications for the mechanical enclosure. So that describes how you're addressing the what's. So hopefully that helps a little bit, Kit.
Thank you. Daniel asks, how do you deal with a situation which design controls were applied after the project started?
Yeah, I mean, Daniel, I wish it weren't the case, but I know sometimes that is the situation and the scenario that's happened. I guess the good news is it's absolutely better to do it, even if retrospectively, than to not at all. My advice to you is to start and develop a design and development process, capturing design controls early in the process, because it's way easier to be able to address and make design decisions as you start to document these things earlier versus after the fact. But listen, I don't know where you were in that continuum, but let's imagine that you were getting ready for verification and you're starting the testing and you realize that you didn't have all of your specifications, all your design outputs defined, or your design inputs, or your requirements defined. Still good to press pause at that point and go back and make sure you define all that criteria. Better late than never. Um, um, I, I don't know if there's something more specific than that you're looking for. If you'd like to talk about your situation and your circumstances, I guess just give me a ring, shoot me an email, and be happy to go into more detail.
Christine wants an example, please, of an inspection or an analysis as a verification method.
Oh, sure. So I might have mentioned the length example earlier. So if I specify that, again, maybe I have a needle that I want to be a certain length from a user need perspective in order to reach the subclavian artery. All right, so that's more of a user need. So from a design input standpoint, I might need to do a little bit of research. And well, how superficial or how close to the surface is that subclavian artery uh, to the skin level, and is there any special anatomy that's involved in that sort of thing? So from there, I start to derive certain characteristics or certain requirements about this product. And one of the things that I may come up with is, well, the needle that I'm going to design and develop needs to be a certain length. It has to at least be able to go. And I'm making these numbers up, folks. So if I'm totally wrong, then fine. I'm just for illustration purposes, but maybe it needs to be between five. The research that I did defines that the subclavian artery is at least 5 centimeters deep below the skin or what have you. So I did start to define, it needs to be 5 centimeters, and then, but I may want to define, sort of another end of the needle as well, because um, can it be at least 5, or does it need to be less than 10? But anyway, I'm starting to hone in on a criteria. But now I start to figure out that it needs to be 5 centimeters plus 0 minus, or plus 2 minus 0, whatever. But I come up with a criteria around that. Now I don't need to test that. In fact, what would I do to test that length? I mean, that if I'm going to test the length, I could certainly do that, but that might be more of a function of my manufacturing process. And good, maybe it's still a great thing to do. But as far as confirming or verifying that my outputs meet my input, in that case, I would inspect or analyze my drawing or my specifications that I've defined for that. And I think a key thing to keep in mind when we do verification is that we have to make some assumptions. And one assumption is that we've manufactured the product according to the specifications that we defined. And so as long as the information provided, we assume that it's been manufactured according to those specifications, then I can use inspection as a method to confirm length is appropriate.
Thank you. Rick
You're welcome.
asks, if his device only provides information to a physician, it sounds like he has to worry about the risk a physician will sometimes make the wrong decision, even though Rick provided accurate data in a clear, unambiguous way. This seems unfair, but more importantly, what do I do about it? Is it considered okay or acceptable risk? Is he thinking about this all the wrong way?
No, Rick, I believe you are thinking about it in the right way. And um, yeah, sometimes the things that we do as clear and objective and unambiguous as we intend to be, um, we still have to think about, what would happen. And I'll, the topic of misuse, whether intended or unintended, is a loaded topic all by itself. Um, but it is something that when we look at risk, we have to think about, what is that the data and information that I'm providing to that end user. We have to think about, that's why risk is a two-factor thing. It's why we think about the probability and the severity. So what is the likelihood or the probability that information would be misinterpreted? So that's one factor. And if it is misinterpreted, what is the harm that would result from that? And that's why we have to think about those two factors. And for me and I think this is a really great example, because one thing that's important about the design and development of our product is that we need to validate the design. We need to prove that we designed the correct medical device. And part of, in this case, proving that we designed the correct medical device is to have our doctors involved in the design validation activities, provide them with simulated data that we believe to be clear, objective, and unambiguous, and confirm that they make the decisions based on that data that we would expect. So you can design a whole test or protocol around demonstrating that, and use that proof and evidence to corroborate what you identify from a probability and severity. And then once you launch this product into the marketplace, and that's something that you want to monitor and evaluate over time. You want to get customer feedback and especially if you have any sort of complaints or issues, monitor that so that you make sure that you have the proper controls in place for that product going forward. But it's a wonderful example of how design controls and risk, the whole intent behind that is to do exactly what you're saying, is to make sure that you have the proper controls in place to mitigate and reduce risk to acceptable levels.
Jan asks, how do you keep track of various legal requirements, standards, and company requirements?
Yeah, and I don't have a terrific answer for you. I mean, there are lots of things out there all the time. I mean, there are some standards. I know some partners of Greenlight Guru have different databases where they manage and maintain standards. I mean, FDA has a list of consensus standards that they've identified, but that's becoming, or it can be, a very challenging scenario. One of the key things that I would advise you is for the products that you have designing or developing or already in the market, is understand the specific regulations that pertain to your products. Oftentimes, or sometimes, not oftentimes, depending on classification, there might be other guidance documents or standards and so on. But this is the whole idea about treating your products, making sure you're addressing total product lifecycle processes, because things do change, and somebody needs to kind of keep their finger on the pulse of what's happening with new guidance documents and information. Personally, I subscribe to Google keywords is a good example. Anytime I see certain words, I have a few of these, like risk management is one of those words. Every day I get an alert from Google to see all the times that word was used in content or blog article or something out there. So it's coming to my inbox, and so you can do those same sorts of things. But I would recommend that you do periodic reviews of your products within your portfolio, and you do a somewhat exhaustive search of standards that are out there. It's a big part of the the EU MDR process as well. Clinical evaluation is comprehensive and looking at those types of things as well. So it's an expected behavior if you're going to have medical devices, is that you're being holistic with that.
We'll wrap
Challenging.
up in 5 minutes because I actually have a hard stop too. Linda asks, what are the requirements for the independent reviewer?
Yeah, this one, good question, Linda, because this one on the surface is more confusing than it needs to be. The independent reviewer, let me tell you some things that that person cannot be. They should not be an active member on your team. So it's not like you can, if on my project are Tom and Nick, and one day Tom is the independent reviewer and the next day Nick is the independent reviewer. No, if they're an active contributing team member to my project, that really disqualifies them for serving in that role of independent reviewer. Um, if you've got if you're working a company and there are multiple product development teams, and team A is working on device A and team B is working on device B, well, somebody who's working on team B probably might be a great resource to serve as the independent reviewer. So I don't want you to lose too much sleep over it. Just make sure that that person is somewhat objective, that they don't have a bias towards your product development efforts, that they're not a contributing team member as part of that process, but also make sure that they have enough experience, I'll say, to be able to provide feedback into the design of good feedback to the design and development process. If you're just having somebody making sure they got a pulse and that they can sign their name and they can check a box, kind of misses the intent behind that. The idea behind the independent reviewer, the intent behind the independent reviewer, is that somebody, a new, fresh set of eyes, a fresh voice who's looking and evaluating what you're doing, and basically asking some tough questions from time to time, so that at the end of the day, that product that you're designing and developing is going to be as safe and effective as possible.
Bryson asks, is it acceptable to have design transfer going on at the time of a pre-approval inspection by FDA as part of a PMA?
Can you ask that question again? I think I was tracking with you, and I wanted to
Is it
make sure.
acceptable to have design transfer ongoing at the same time FDA is doing a pre-approval inspection as part of the PMA process?
Yeah, I think that's fine. It's a little bit tricky. I don't know all the nuances there, but usually, because I know the FDA does, they've broken up the PMA approval process into multiple different steps.
In the
But
interest of time, maybe I'll ask Royson to get in touch with you directly.
yeah,
with
that'd probably be easier, because I want to understand where they are in that process.
James asks, is software specification a design output or input?
All right, so good question, James. That there's usually, when you talk about software specification, in my experience anyway, and from what a lot of the guidance documents that are out there in standards, there's a key word that goes in front of specification and after software. Are we talking software requirement specification or software design specification? Because depending on, it could be either a requirement or a design input, or it could be an output. I need to know a little bit more. Software specification by itself is pretty generic. So I tell you what, James, I know I have a hard stop, and I know Joe has a hard stop. Shoot me a note, and let's have a conversation about that.
If you weren't so good and your answer's so thorough, this wouldn't be a problem. I'm just saying. Look, there are at least 24 more questions.
Yeah.
We'll call it here. But I
Okay.
suspect that with your abundant free time, you can type out answers to all of these questions. So, folks, I give them the grace of a day or two to get back with you. But
Yeah,
I'm
Joe,
sure that
I will answer every question that's asked.
I know you will. Ladies and gentlemen, John Spear, Greenlight Guru, let's hear it. I'm not hearing anything, but they're typing. Good job. Thank you. Very appreciated. On behalf of the Medical Devices Group, Mr. Spear, I thank you once again. Thanks. I'm sure we'll be talking soon.
All right.
Bye, everyone.